The butterfly effect is a well-known phenomenon. A seemingly insignificant event can dramatically alter the course of the future. But what if that event was steeped in trauma? For one innocent teenager who aspired to a bright future, the tides turned unexpectedly, transforming her into something monstrous. Could a single traumatic childhood event truly instigate such a dramatic metamorphosis? Is the butterfly effect merely fiction, or is it a brutal reality? 10-year-old Justin Kimball endured severe brain damage and was placed in a medically induced coma. Yet, against all odds, he survived. His first words upon awakening stunned the family gathered at his bedside. One evening in July 2004, while a father and his two sons were digging a hole in the backyard, a moment of distraction changed everything. As the father pointed out towards the horizon, trying to share a moment with Justin, a loud crash echoed through the yard. A heavy metal cattle grid had fallen, striking Justin on the head. On the frantic drive to the hospital, another chilling event unfolded. In a moment of panic, the father attempted to push his son out of the moving car. Was this a fevered hallucination or a horrifying reality? In February 2003, Lori McLeod, a divorced woman living with her daughter Casey, met Scott Lee Kimball at a small casino in Colorado. This fateful encounter would alter their lives in unimaginable ways. Lori first spotted Scott playing cards. The moment their eyes met, an undeniable spark ignited. Scott radiated a sense of calm and protection, drawing Lori in. He was the kind of man one instinctively wanted to trust. Lori McLeod placed her trust in him. Scott Lee Kimball, under the guise of an FBI agent, charmed her with tales of outdoor adventures and fatherhood. From their very first encounter, Lori found herself captivated by Scott's undeniable charisma. While he didn't fit the mold of conventional male beauty, Scott treated Lori like royalty and showed kindness to her daughter, Casey. Eventually, Scott moved into the McLeod home near Denver, where Casey, at 19 years old, was beginning to reclaim her life. Having recently battled substance dependency, Casey had turned her life around. By the time Scott arrived, she was clean, had made new friends, and secured a job, signaling her return to normalcy. However, everything changed one fateful summer day in 2003. Scott discovered a glass tube in Casey's room and brought it to Lori, who recognized its implications. This revelation ignited a fierce argument between mother and daughter. In a heated exchange, Lori chastised Casey for what she perceived as a relapse, while Casey vehemently denied ownership of the substance. She swore to her mother that she had not touched the white powder in months. Yet Lori's disappointment ran deep. Threatening to involve the police, she insisted on sending Casey to a treatment facility, fearing her daughter was unable to overcome her addiction on her own. Their argument escalated, exchanging hurtful words. Finally, Casey, overwhelmed by the confrontation, threw on her jacket and stormed out of the house. Initially, Lori, angered by her daughter's defiance, felt little concern for her departure. This was not the first time Casey had left after a dispute. But when Lori learned the following day that her daughter had missed work, a creeping unease settled over her. Had Casey truly succumbed to the struggles she had fought so hard to escape? Lori's attempts to reach Casey proved futile, and the police refused to file a missing person report. As an adult, Casey had the right to go wherever she pleased without notifying her mother. There were no signs indicating foul play. Casey had simply fled after their argument. At the time, Scott was out hunting, leaving Lori feeling utterly helpless. When Scott returned several days later, he reassured Lori that Casey would eventually return home. He vowed to leverage his supposed FBI connections to help locate her if she did not reappear soon. Signs began to emerge that hinted at Casey's fate. One fateful day, Scott discovered one of her gold jewelry pieces dangling from a doorknob, while a makeup kit had mysteriously disappeared from her room, raising the alarm bells in his mind. The clues suggested that Casey might still be nearby, returning home under the cover of her mother's absence. It became evident that she was strategically collecting her belongings during Lori's work hours. Through his own channels, Scott learned that Casey, accompanied by her boyfriend, had checked into a motel in Adams County. A few days later, a glimmer of hope appeared when Casey reached out to Lori, expressing love and regret in a heartfelt message. But the hope was short-lived. Casey vanished once more, leaving no trace behind. Lori's determination to find her daughter intensified, leading her to locate Casey's boyfriend, who claimed they had been at a motel together. The last sighting of Casey, he reported, was when Scott picked her up to take her to work. But Scott vehemently denied this encounter, insisting it was a fabrication, casting a shadow of doubt on the boyfriend's credibility. Despite the conflicting stories, the boyfriend vowed to assist in the search for Lori's daughter, suggesting that Casey simply needed time to sort through her troubles. Lori, recognizing her daughter's autonomy, reluctantly accepted this explanation. In an attempt to distract from the turmoil, Scott proposed to Lori, promising to care for her and vowing to track Casey's financial movements to pinpoint her location. At this juncture, Lori placed her trust in Scott's assurances, unaware of the darkness that loomed ahead. With a sense of optimism, they tied the knot in a Las Vegas chapel, sealing their commitment before returning to Denver, where the shadows of uncertainty continued to stretch over their lives. Scott's perception of masculinity distorted his relationship with his sons, particularly Justin, whom he mockingly referred to as Susie. One evening in July 2004, as Scott and the boys dug a hole in their backyard, an ordinary moment turned catastrophic. In a desperate bid to secure her family's future, Lori took out life insurance policies, naming Scott as the sole beneficiary. At that moment, uncertainty clouded her mind as she feared for her missing daughter's safety, unaware of the depths of Scott's intentions. Lori's hope rested on Scott, her unwavering support in the face of her daughter's possible descent into addiction. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the silence surrounding Casey's whereabouts grew deafening. The couple relocated outside Denver, aiming to build a new life and business in their first year of marriage. Yet, beneath the surface of their new beginnings, tension simmered between the spouses. Scott often vanished for long stretches, citing work commitments, and when Lori sought answers, his temper flared, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated. Scott's two sons from a previous marriage, Justin and Cody, occasionally visited. Lori observed the gentle 9-year-old Justin often became the target of Scott's frustration, a troubling dynamic that cast a shadow over their family life. Scott's sons from his first marriage, Justin and Cody, would occasionally visit their father's home. Lori, Scott's wife, observed with concern how 9-year-old Justin, gentle and soft-hearted, often became the target of Scott's erratic behavior. As young Cody dashed inside for water and hurried back outside, he soon re-entered the house, his face pale, screaming that his brother Justin had been injured and they needed to call 911. Scott rushed outside, cradling his injured son. He told Lori he would drive Justin to the nearest hospital, urgency in his voice as he hurried to the truck, leaving Lori feeling a mix of fear and confusion. Lori grabbed Cody and followed closely. Upon arriving at the hospital, a scene of chaos awaited them. Justin lay on a gurney, his body racked with convulsions, blood staining the sheets around him. A nurse recounted the story as described by Scott, how a heavy metal grid had fallen on Justin in the yard, and during the drive to the hospital, a tragic accident occurred when the boy attempted to open the car window. In a horrifying twist, the door handle was inadvertently hit, causing Justin to tumble out of the truck at 60 miles per hour, resulting in catastrophic injuries that left everyone doubting he would survive. Incredibly, after 2 harrowing weeks in an induced coma, Justin awakened, his first words chillingly directed at his father, asking why Daddy had done this to him, casting an unsettling pall over their family's already fractured reality. In a disturbing revelation, the boy recounted how his father had dropped a heavy grid on him before callously pushing him out of a moving car. The treating physicians, alarmed by the child's claims, speculated that his injuries might have disrupted his brain function. They feared that the boy's perception of the traumatic events had become distorted. The police were called to investigate, but the complexities of jurisdiction left them stymied as both incidents occurred in different areas, creating confusion about which department should take charge. To the horror of Justin's mother, no charges were filed against Scott. In a desperate bid to protect her son, she contacted her insurance company and removed her ex-husband's name from the beneficiaries list. Justin's life was safeguarded by a $50,000 policy, and the sudden turn of events led his mother to recall a chilling conversation from the day before. Scott had asked her who the beneficiary of Justin's life insurance policy was, igniting fears that he might have aimed to take his own son's life for financial gain. Just days after Justin's harrowing accident, Scott's uncle, the 60-year-old Terry Kimball, unexpectedly appeared at the family home, bringing with him a suitcase stuffed with cash he had withdrawn from his savings. Lori, Scott's wife, was deeply unsettled by this new relative. Terry had a penchant for drinking heavily and often wandered the house without clothes, accompanied by 2 unruly dogs. His presence filled the home with an unsettling air that Lori could hardly tolerate. This heavy-set man stirred an aversion in Lori that she couldn't shake. Uncle Terry claimed he had come to stay with Scott to start a business venture, and his uninvited presence loomed over the household, threatening to linger for months, if not years. Yet much to Lori's relief, after just a few weeks, Terry vanished without a trace. Scott relayed an astonishing tale of how his uncle had supposedly won the lottery and fled to Mexico with a stripper, or perhaps to the Caribbean. While Lori sighed with relief, the bizarre events began to take a toll on their marriage, creating a rift that would prove difficult to mend. As the tension grew, Lori felt her connection to Scott slipping away. She began to suspect him of infidelity, noticing how he frequently disappeared for long stretches. When he returned, his excuses revolved around work commitments that seemed less and less convincing. Despite the crumbling state of her marriage, Lori remained steadfast in her search for answers regarding her missing daughter, Casey. By late 2005, the foundation of Scott and Lori's relationship had nearly collapsed. Scott's increasing absence and disinterest in finding Casey left Lori feeling invisible. She suspected he might be entangled with someone in California, where he often traveled during this tumultuous period in early 2006. Weeks after Uncle Terry's abrupt disappearance, the bank detected suspicious activity on his credit card. Fraudulent checks totaling around $80,000 were reported, triggering an investigation that ultimately led authorities to Scott Kimball. Police arrived at the ranch where Lori and Scott lived, intent on unraveling the mystery. Lori, bewildered, claimed no knowledge of any illicit finances. She mentioned that Terry had supposedly won lottery money and fled to Mexico with a young girlfriend. Lori expressed her disbelief that anyone would be attracted to the disheveled, heavy-set man, but acknowledged that money might have masked his flaws. At one point, she casually mentioned to the officers that her daughter had been missing for about 2 years, and that Scott had been one of the last people to see her. Lori's suspicions about her husband had been mounting. She feared that Scott might have offered Casey money to vanish, hoping to avoid complications in their relationship. She informed the police that Scott had worked for the FBI, prompting detectives investigating the bank fraud to delve deeper into Scott's past, uncovering a web of intriguing details. Scott Lee Kimball, born on September 21, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado, had a childhood shrouded in obscurity. When he was just 10 years old, a seismic shift occurred in his life when his mother revealed her sexual orientation to his father, ultimately leading to their divorce. Scott's father left the state and remarried, leaving a young boy grappling with the emotional fallout of the separation. As a teenager, Scott's rebellion manifested in troubling behavior, including an incident where he shot out neighborhood windows using his father's gun. Scott Lee Kimball entered the world on September 21, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. His early years remain largely shrouded in mystery. However, a pivotal moment unfolded when he was just 10 years old. His mother made a startling revelation to his father. She was gay. The unraveling of Scott's family life led to a divorce, a turning point that would shape his future. His father left the state, remarrying, while the separation left a profound mark on young Scott. In his early teens, he crossed the line into delinquency, using his father's gun to shatter windows in the neighborhood, a cry for attention masked as rebellion. Scott Lee Kimball and his younger brother, Brett, found themselves living in their grandmother's mobile home, a temporary refuge from their troubled lives. It was here that a man named Theodore Payton preyed upon the vulnerable teenager. He initially approached Scott, masquerading as a friend, but soon his intentions turned sinister. In a horrifying act of betrayal, Payton coerced Scott into undressing and photographed him. He then unleashed a torrent of threats, warning the boy that if he dared to speak out, his father back in Montana would face dire consequences. The nightmare escalated. The 41-year-old man bound and assaulted Scott, recording the horrific acts on video. As the abuse unfolded, Scott was trapped in a cycle of fear. Every weekend, when he visited Boulder from Hamilton, Montana, he encountered the man who had stripped away his innocence. The torment continued unabated until Scott reached the age of 23, but the scars of his past would linger far beyond that. Overwhelmed by the weight of his trauma, Scott attempted to escape his pain in the most drastic way. He shot himself in the head, a desperate act that left him in critical condition for several days in intensive care. When he finally emerged from the hospital, he was a changed man, marked by the darkness of his experiences. Determined to seek justice, Scott, alongside other boys who had suffered similar fates at the hands of Payton, reported the man to the Boulder police. Their accounts led to Payton's arrest on charges of child molestation, resulting in a 7-year prison sentence. Yet, the psychological damage inflicted on Scott during his formative years would haunt him for a lifetime. At the age of 22, Scott found himself in legal trouble again, this time convicted of check forgery. After serving his sentence, he returned to Colorado, where the shadows of his past loomed large. He reverted to a life of crime, burglarizing homes in a desperate bid for money, the only thing he ever truly loved. Scott's personal life mirrored his criminal endeavors. His first marriage crumbled almost immediately, and his second marriage, which produced 2 sons, was anything but harmonious. His wife grew weary of Scott's persistent, shady dealings and ultimately filed for divorce. Even after their separation, their tumultuous relationship endured for 2 more years, until it imploded when Scott's ex-wife accused him of sexual coercion. Scott, however, dismissed her allegations, claiming she merely sought to undermine his attempts to gain full custody of their children. In 2000, Scott violated his probation stemming from his earlier fraud conviction, landing him back behind bars. But a year later, he orchestrated an audacious escape from custody, stealing a cash truck from a gas station. For a time, Scott impersonated his brother, managing to evade the law by fleeing to Alaska, where he even managed to marry and divorce under a false identity. Eventually, however, the walls began to close in on him. He was captured and sentenced to federal prison. In a bid for leniency, Scott convinced FBI agents to use him as an informant, which led to some charges being dropped due to the lack of reports on his previous crimes. His criminal record grew darker, involving violent offenses. After securing his release on bail in 2002, Scott moved in with his mother and her partner, borrowing $65,000 from relatives to launch a new venture. He embarked on an organic beef business, but this supposed turn toward reform was deceptive. His ex-wife returned to Colorado, still gripped by fear of Scott, yet allowing him to see their sons. As police investigated ongoing fraud cases, they unearthed disturbing links tying Scott Kimball to the mysterious disappearance of another young woman, Jennifer Lynn Markham. Jennifer vanished near Denver less than a year before another girl, Casey, would go missing. At just 25, she was a single mother and a dancer at an adult club. Her car was found abandoned at Denver Airport, yet there was no evidence she had left the state, at least not by plane. The FBI soon joined the search for Jennifer Markham, but progress was painfully slow. In the midst of the investigation, a man calling himself Joe Snitch emerged, contacting Jennifer's family with an offer that sent shivers down their spines. He claimed he could lead them to the mountains, to the place where Jennifer was buried, but demanded that the trip remain a secret from the police. The Markham family, gripped by despair and distrust, feared that they were being targeted by yet another scammer looking to exploit their grief. The thought of venturing into the mountains with a stranger felt fraught with danger. They worried he might be a threat to their lives. When detectives visited the Markham family, they learned about this enigmatic figure, Joe Snitch, and the unsettling possibility that he might hold the key to Jennifer's disappearance. As the investigation deepened, the shadows surrounding Scott Lee Kimball grew darker, intertwining with the fates of the women who had vanished, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and shattered lives. How could he possess such specific details regarding her death? Fortunately, the police quickly uncovered Joe's true identity. What began as an investigation into fraudulent bank checks transformed into a search for two missing young women, Casey McLeod and Jennifer Markham, all linked to one man, Scott Kimball, known by the alias Joe Snitch. During their inquiries, detectives stumbled upon a peculiar incident from 2004 involving Kimball's 10-year-old son, Justin. As the investigation deepened, suspicions arose regarding the nature of this so-called accident. Upon regaining consciousness, the child claimed his father was responsible for his grave injuries. The investigation turned darker when it became apparent that no one had seen Scott's 60-year-old uncle, Terry Kimball, since he allegedly won the lottery and vanished from the United States with his mistress. Lori, Scott's wife, recounted to officers how one day, she returned home from work to find the furniture rearranged. Scott had removed a white leather couch, one marred by a noticeable stain. When Lori inquired about the stain, Scott explained that one of his uncle's dogs had vomited on it. With Terry gone, Scott claimed he simply wanted to dispose of the damaged furniture. By March 2006, police had compiled a list of inquiries for Scott, ranging from counterfeit checks to the attempted murder of his own son. An arrest warrant was subsequently issued. However, Scott had seemingly vanished. He managed to call Lori from Alaska and even sent photographs. Yet, when detectives traced the call, it led them to a residential address in California on March 14, 2006. After 2 months of searching, police finally tracked Scott down to arrest him. What ensued was a high-speed chase that lasted several hours. The pursuit ended only when Scott's truck ran out of fuel, leaving him stranded in a field. Yet even then, he continued to defy the officers, initially refusing to exit the vehicle, fearing for his life. After prolonged negotiations, Scott ultimately chose to surrender. Finally in custody, questions loomed. How could Scott orchestrate such a web of crimes while evading the police at every turn? His criminal life began the moment he turned 18. By the age of 40, Scott had accumulated 10 convictions, though none for violent offenses. Ironically, FBI agents, for whom Scott had served as an informant, never suspected he was capable of violent retribution. Scott had served time in Colorado, Montana, Washington, and Alaska for crimes including theft, fraud, and document forgery. Although he faced accusations of abducting his former wife, those charges were ultimately dismissed. As a key witness in several FBI investigations, Scott's name surfaced in cases involving a planned assault on a judge in Alaska, an attack on a lawyer's assistant in Seattle, and a federal arson case in Montana. Before crossing paths with Lori McLeod while imprisoned for fraud, Kimball had disclosed information concerning an impending crime in exchange for a cooperation agreement. As a paid informant, seeking a reduced prison sentence, Scott befriended another inmate plotting the assassination of a female witness. This witness was none other than Jennifer Markham. Shortly after his release in 2003, just before meeting Lori, Kimball began surveilling Jennifer under FBI orders. The young woman was slated to testify regarding a drug distribution network. Later, it became apparent that no plan existed to eliminate her. Scott had been deceiving the FBI all along. Nearly all the information he provided turned out to be worthless for investigating other crimes. Most of it was ultimately revealed as fabrications. Yet, agents. As time went on, it became apparent that Scott had been spinning a web of deceit around the FBI. Almost all the information he provided proved futile for their investigations. Much of it ultimately revealed to be fabrications. Yet agents remained determined to uncover the truth. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, many continued to hold the belief that Scott Lee Kimball was incapable of taking a life. This perception might have lingered in obscurity had it not been for the desperate actions of Jennifer Markham's and Casey McLeod's fathers, who stormed into the police station demanding answers. It was only at this pivotal moment that authorities began to take a more serious approach to the disappearances of the young women. The realization dawned upon them that Joe Snitch, Scott's alias, might pose a far greater threat than they had initially believed. Police quickly uncovered the unsettling truth that Uncle Terry had never won any lottery and had also mysteriously disappeared. Investigators found no evidence suggesting he had left the state or even the country, raising suspicions about his fate. Meanwhile, FBI agents seized Scott's computer. What they discovered would haunt them. Among the files were photographs of women who had endured unspeakable torture. One image, in particular, sent a chill through the officers. A young woman smiling eerily, seemingly unbothered, suggesting she could be yet another unknown victim. With this grim evidence, Scott was summoned for questioning, as detectives sought to piece together the unfolding nightmare. During the interrogation, Scott vehemently denied any wrongdoing. He insisted that if his Uncle Terry hadn't fled the country, he must be living a carefree life somewhere in the United States. When pressed about the girls' disappearances, Scott claimed complete ignorance, leaving investigators with no new leads. Frustrated, detectives turned their attention to Scott's former cellmates, including a man named Stephen Holly. Serving a life sentence, Holly revealed a chilling plot they had devised together. The two had planned an escape, with Scott set to drive his truck to the prison wall, tossing over a ladder for Stephen to climb to freedom. Meanwhile, other inmates were to create a diversion. After Scott's release, he visited Stephen in prison and asked for his girlfriend's contact information, allegedly to aid in their escape plan. Under the guise of Hannibal, Scott's alias, Stephen reached out to his girlfriend, warning her that someone named Hannibal would soon be in touch. This girlfriend was Leanne Emery, a 24-year-old from Idaho, who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a teenager. After meeting Scott, she became embroiled in his check fraud schemes, unaware of the dark path that lay ahead. As communication with Stephen dwindled, he was now in solitary confinement. She grew increasingly dependent on Scott, a dependency that would lead to tragedy. When FBI agents attempted to locate Emery, they discovered she too had vanished. Last seen near Denver in early 2003, her abandoned car was found in Utah. Emails to relatives indicated she was traveling with someone named Hannibal. The investigation took a darker turn when they discovered her photo on Scott's computer. Another name, another missing person tied to Scott Lee Kimball. FBI agents began to connect the dots. Scott Lee Kimball, once regarded as a mere fraudster and forger, was now suspected of being a serial offender who disposed of those he deemed unwanted. This sinister revelation unfolded right under the noses of law enforcement. Detectives returned to Lori's farm, where they uncovered a receipt among Scott's belongings, dated the day 19-year-old Casey McLeod was last seen. The store was located near a national park, raising further suspicions. During subsequent interrogations, when detectives pressed Scott about his stepdaughter Casey's fate, he initially attempted to evade the question. Eventually, Scott shared a story that took investigators by surprise. He claimed that Casey had died from an overdose, possibly in the Route Wilderness area. Determined to verify his account, FBI agents ventured into the national park. Their search led them to a grim discovery. A human skull, recently found by a hunter, was confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Casey McLeod. With this chilling evidence that at least one missing person connected to Scott was indeed dead, detectives felt the pressure mount. Finally, Scott was offered a plea deal, leaving him with little choice but to plead guilty. The web of deceit was tightening around him, and the truth was beginning to surface. What initially appeared to be a mere fraudster and forger began to morph into something more sinister. FBI agents started to suspect that Scott Lee Kimball might be a serial offender, someone who had a chilling ability to dispose of individuals who had outlived their usefulness. This dark reality unfolded right under the noses of law enforcement. Detectives returned to Laurie's farm, where they discovered a store receipt among Scott's belongings. This receipt was dated the very day 19-year-old Casey McLeod was last seen, a detail that sent shivers down their spines. During another tense interrogation, detectives pressed Scott about the fate of his stepdaughter, Casey. Initially, he attempted to dodge their questions, but the walls were closing in, and his facade began to crack. During one chilling confession, Scott shared a story that had eluded law enforcement. He claimed that a girl had died from an overdose, possibly in the Rewrote wilderness area. This prompted FBI agents to investigate his claims in the national park. As the investigation unfolded, park rangers informed the agents of a recent discovery. A hunter had stumbled upon a human skull, which forensic analysis later confirmed belonged to a young woman, Casey McLeod, with tangible evidence indicating that at least one missing person last seen with Scott was deceased. Detectives seized the opportunity to exert pressure. A plea deal was extended to Scott, compelling him to plead guilty. In a desperate attempt to save himself from the looming death penalty, Scott agreed to reveal the locations of 3 additional bodies: Leanne Emery, Jennifer Markham, and Terry Kimball. He recognized that evading law enforcement was no longer an option. Scott led authorities to Utah, indicating where Leanne Emery's body was hidden. He recounted a harrowing tale of taking her to Bryce Canyon, where he forced her to kneel on a rock before pulling the trigger with a gun she had purchased for him just days prior during their check fraud scheme. Her parents, unaware of the horrific fate that had befallen their daughter, initially believed she had taken a trip to Mexico for spelunking, a hobby she loved. They clung to hope, certain she would soon return and reclaim her life. But as days turned into weeks without communication, their worry deepened. The young girl had taken up spelunking, a hobby that sparked hope in her parents. They believed this newfound passion would guide her back to a brighter path. But when she suddenly ceased all communication, a deep sense of dread began to settle over the family. After their daughter went missing, her parents filed a report, but authorities were slow to act, deeming Leanne an adult capable of making her own choices. Through credit card records, they discovered she never traveled to Mexico as initially believed. A cousin who spoke with Leanne prior to her disappearance mentioned she had been traveling with a man known as Hannibal, someone she feared. However, police showed little interest in pursuing the case. It wasn't until the FBI took an interest in the girl's disappearance that the investigation gained momentum. Jennifer Markham's body was never located. The offender admitted he could no longer remember where he had left it. Scott met Jennifer 2 weeks after his release from prison. He was meant to monitor her as she was a crucial witness. Scott claimed to own several coffee shops in Seattle and invited Jennifer to manage one of his establishments. Jennifer accepted the offer, moving her belongings to Scott's residence. The very next day, both of their mobile phones were turned off. While Scott re-emerged 3 days later, Jennifer's phone never powered on again. The body of Terry Kimball, Scott's uncle, was discovered at his nephew's direction on a remote mountain in Colorado. Scott had taken the cash that his uncle had brought for their supposed joint business venture. In a shocking turn of events, Scott Lee Kimball, who had disposed of his victims, saw only 2 bodies recovered out of a total of 5. Despite a plea deal collapsing, Scott pled guilty to all 4 killings, resulting in Scott receiving a staggering 70-year prison sentence. At the time, he was already serving a 48-year term for fraud. During the trial, Scott placed the blame on the FBI, accusing them of pushing him into a perilous criminal underworld. After sentencing, prosecutors and investigators informed the media of their belief that the 4 murders Scott confessed to were merely the tip of the iceberg. In prison, Scott boasted to fellow inmates about having taken dozens of lives. While he may have been embellishing, there was likely some truth to his claims. The alarming speed and ease with which Scott eliminated unwanted individuals indicated a disturbing level of experience. It is crucial to note that his 4 victims were vulnerable individuals, marginalized by society, whose disappearances would not raise immediate alarms. They often engaged in theft and fraud. Scott's victims often struggled with substance abuse and were social outcasts. The authorities linked him to other violent cases, including that of Katrina Powell, whose lifestyle mirrored that of Scott's other victims. Around the same time Scott resided in suburban Denver, another victim, Leanne Emery, was found dead. He confessed to an inmate about ending her life, yet he never disclosed this to the authorities. Scott is believed to be linked to more than 24 missing persons cases. Theodore Payton, the man who had robbed teenage Scott of a normal childhood, died in January 2017. His lifeless body was discovered near a cabin in the Netherlands. Heart disease was determined as the cause of death. Payton served 5 years of his 7-year sentence after Scott and other victims testified against him. Nonetheless, the memories of childhood humiliation continued to torment Scott throughout his life. Scott Lee Kimball carried a scar on his forehead, a haunting reminder of a desperate attempt to escape his own shame. It was a moment that could have altered the course of his life dramatically. One can only ponder how different things might have been had fate not intertwined his path with another. This is the essence of the butterfly effect. A single event can lead to unforeseen consequences. A single, seemingly insignificant moment can shift the course of one's life forever. Imagine if that moment was shrouded in deep trauma for an innocent teenager, one who merely aspired to a bright and joyful future.